It was the kind of town that still burned the leaves in the fall. Harold would watch the neighbors rake the leaves into piles in the broad lawns that fronted the streets of the small New England town, and then chuckled as the small boys in the street would charge through them and send them scattering and billowing into the crisp air, and the neighbors who would send the boys scattering through the backyards after they'd had their fun. Fairhaven, Everytown, New England. He thought about it as they stood in the cramped Grange Hall, smelling of woolens just taken from the old sea chest and the chiffon-robes to ward off the premature chill of winter that scudded in on the low-lying clouds out of the rocks and crags of the mountains of New Hampshire. His neighbors wore the woolens, and the radiators knocking on the sides of the Grange Hall announced another flood of heat that would increase the closeness and mustiness and hominess of this place. The four-poster bed that his wife wanted was buried under a mound of doilies and hopeful Tiffany lampshades, not-so-solid brass candlesticks, quilts, and an incomplete erector set. It was incomplete because some budding Leonardo had taken up shelter in a coal bin that was promptly filled, burying parts many years ago with shining lumps of anthracite. The surviving girders now reposed atop the four-poster that Betty wanted, would not leave without, and had to have or else, and well, it would be such a great addition to their already antique furnished home in Fairhaven. And isn't it just wonderful, Harold, that we should find it here? And when will the auctioneer ever get to it? The predictable earthenware baked bean pot was on the block now. God, if he ever saw another baked bean pot. The circuit auctioneer, making the rounds once every 2 weeks or so, was cleverly hiding the crack that marked the dull clay surface. And some matron whose home was no doubt full to the brim with baked bean pots was bidding furiously, while an equally enthusiastic bidder, a younger one, making her first foray into the world of earthenware baked bean pots, was attempting to outbid her and launch her career of overstuffing her home with items of antiquity, even though this one was cracked. Harold smiled to himself despite the heat of the place, and despite the woolens that smelled of mothballs and camphor, despite his wife's urgency to bid on and to get the four-poster bed. Good people, he thought. Fairhaven people. They'd been quiet and courteous when they moved. And his writing, since he had come to the small New England town, had improved, and his articles and lectures were even more in demand without the pressures and obsessive drive of the big city life that they had left behind. Go north, young man, he'd said to himself. And so he and Betty had packed up their things, and they had gone north. They'd sought a home in Fairhaven, one that was big and old and had character and antiquity and legend, and if old was character, they had it. If legend was the fact that a previous owner had been a moonshiner, well, they had that too. But Lord, wouldn't that bed ever get out on the block? A couple of hours in the hall with his closeness to camphor-laden, multi-hued wool was about all he could take. Betty wriggled next to him with impatience. He has to admit that she had done a magnificent job on the house, stripping, painting, refinishing. When she first laid eyes on the old antique bed this evening, he knew, and she knew, that they had to have it. From where he stood, it looked as though a little rubbing, a little polishing, a little glue would do the job, and the old bedstead would be ready to become part of their treasures. From where he stood, it looked as though the auction was coming to an end, and not a mention of the bed. It still reposed under a somewhat diminished pile of treasures, and everyone was putting on their coats. Under Betty's urgings, he stepped into the small stage area and asked that the bed be put up for bids. What had been a hall full of round people making a hall full of round noises became a hall full of shrunken people making no noise whatever. The only sound that could be heard was the pounding of the radiators along the wall, forcing the heat into a room that Harold was discovering was becoming more and more stifling with each passing moment. Harold wondered what he had done as he turned from the obviously nervous auctioneer to look around at the crowd. And Abner Kellogg stepped forward.
Harold, being new round here, you don't know about that bed.
The clipped nasal twang of the New England hills filtered through his thoughts. And almost with a start, he turned around to look at the local hardware dealer. Oh, I'm sorry, Abner. I didn't hear you.
I said, being new round here, perhaps you don't know about that bed. It's bad luck, that bed. Plain bad luck. And all these good folks will attest to it.
A murmur of agreement ran through the crowd, and heads nodded sagely and wisely. And a couple of fingers even shook ominously in Harold's direction. A small smile coursed through Harold's features as the reason for the change in the crowd came to him. Superstition. Superstition indeed. Abe, you make your own luck, he said with finality. And turning to the auctioneer, inquired menacingly, "Now, you going to put that bet up for sale or not?" The tone of his voice led the auctioneer to believe that he had very little choice. The pickup truck was in great shape for as old as it was. Any place else and it would probably be a classic. Harold had bought it from the local garage after he and Betty moved to Fairhaven. He added a few things, repaired a few things, and rebuilt the engine. And it ran fine. It rattled a bit, but ran fine and suited him and his style of living to a T. The bed lay in the back, wrapped in a couple of old blankets that Harold carried. As they drove, he thought about it.
Cheap enough. Not another bidder. Couldn't understand it.
They'd finally gotten a good look at the warmth and tone of the wood. You could see it through the filth and the grime that covered the bed. It would be a job to bring it back, but that's what's so great about wood. You can bring it back. Not like other things.
Not another bidder.
The small finger of uneasiness that began to creep at him was broken by a cry of complaint from his wife when the old truck went over a bump with a good solid chunk. They don't build them like they used to, Betty.
This is WKBW at 1520 on your Buffalo dial.
Being a writer left a great deal of time on your hands. His articles finished and no deadlines to meet, Harold was pretty much his own boss. He could spend the next several days working on the bed. It would take that. Accumulated paint and varnish would have to be removed, not to mention just plain old dirt caked on, baked in, and tough to get off. But it was a labor of love. Harold and Betty could see that what they had bought was really a masterpiece created at the hands of some craftsman who loved his work. And as they worked, determined to pay as much attention to the detail of the bed and the restoration as the craftsman had paid while making it, neighbors dropped by. First, old Silas, the mailman. Silas had lived in Fairhaven all his life and had never left. I take it back. He once went up to Northwood Narrows, New Hampshire, for a summer festival. He was too old now for the country route in the area, but he still handled the village mail and walked the route every day, priding himself on the fact that he had never missed a day. Neither rain, nor storm, nor dark of night. How's it go, Silas? Silas wheezed and hacked at his asthma and hunkered on an old anvil that stood beside the bed.
Heard about the bed.
I'll bet you have.
Thought Harold, and he watched as Silas settled his spindly shanks on the hard contours of the anvil. Harold knew that he was in for a session, so he slid to the ground to get comfortable, welcoming the break.
Bed belonged to a sea captain.
Silas started and continued to weave the history of the fine piece of furniture in the harsh, nasal sounds of rocky New England. The bed had belonged to a sea captain who had married a beautiful village girl. All of Fairhaven attended the wedding, and all of Fairhaven was witness as the bed was borne from the wagon by the men of the wedding party, draped with festive decorations and carried ceremoniously into the house they would live in.
Returning from months at sea, the captain had found his wife in the arms of another. Enraged, he killed them both, then plunged his knife into his own grief-stricken heart.
And so it began. Harold leaned forward appreciatively as Silas spun the tale.
Bed was put in storage in the same house. House was vacant many years.
A crotchety wheeze caught at his chest, and Harold waited impatiently for the story to continue.
Rich fella bought it. Found the old bed in an attic.
The rasping wheeze of the old man's voice weaved a spell around Harold, who by now had been joined by his wife Betty with coffee, which Silas gratefully accepted and spiced from a small flask he carried on his hip.
Medicinal purposes.
He slyly smiled.
Rich fella bought the house, found the bed, dusted it, slept in it, got killed in it. There's a sword hanging over the bed, there more than 20 years. One day, one fine, bright New England morning, the rich fella doesn't come down to breakfast.
Family investigates, finds him impaled on the mattress by the sword, which has been attached to the wall behind the bed more than 20 years. The sword had fallen from its hangings, pierced the man's neck like a railroad spike, nailed him soundlessly to the bed. Not a sound came from the room prior to their investigation. Now, no sound would come from it, except the muffled sobbings of the bereaved family who had toyed with the fates.
According to Silas,
the bed was put back in storage, the house sold by the widow and boarded up by the local agents.
it lay vacant for many years, with its hideous bed in repose well back in the attic on the 3rd floor. An occasional drunk would pass the time there, but no one ever lived there again. Mute and now blind with the boards nailed across the shutters, no light was admitted and none was wanted. The mansion grieved over its misfortune, and like a fallen woman, the gewgaws, the paint, the gingerbread, all flaked and fell and sagged and became haggard and old and ugly.
Local kids, they knew all about the bed and the superstition that surrounded it. The mansion and the horrors that dwelt there, imagined or real, became part of the local boys' initiation rites. To spend the night there was to prove your manhood. One especially adventurous group decided that to spend the night there was not enough. To spend the night in the old mansion on the 3rd floor, where the bed was, that was something else. That was proof you weren't afraid. Enter the house through the cellar window. Brush the cobwebs from your face.
A small spidery web so gossamer until one meets you in the face and then you'll smother. Up from the cellar, stumbling, falling over the decay that had torn the mansion apart. Crashing into things and one another. Nervous laughter, insane bouts of giggles that had them in tears. Approach the steps. They lead to the 3rd floor. Last one up's a rotten egg. A tumultuous rush from the 1st floor to the 2nd to the 3rd. But the rush is halted as the stamping causes a landing to give way, and a young man's leg plunges through a rotted timber, narrowly avoiding a 2-story fall to the main foyer below. Slowly now, slowly, no accidents. Caution dictates that they go slowly. And finally they reach the 3rd floor of the old house. The place stands naked and old and utterly beaten. Vandals, lightning, whatever, have caused a piece of the roof to collapse, and the elements have found their way in, and years of rain and snow and harsh New England weather have gouged the beauty from the place and replaced it with decay.
Scurrying noises meant the presence of rats, and the shaft of moonlight that fights its way through the low-lying cloud cover strikes the irises of the varmint, and they rattle through a hole followed by a piece of wood. One of the boys had chunked at it. The nightless light of the moon has shown them a stark apparition in the attic as well.
The boys have heard of it.
Boys have heard of it.
But they have never seen it.
They know what has gone on before because of it. And it stands before them. Defiant. Dust and cobwebs. It's only cover. It stands before them defiant. Rats and moonlight. It's only occupants. Stands before them defiant. And the boy, a bold boy, steps toward it. His pride, masculinity, at stake.
Feigning a broad yawn, he says,
"Need a little nap."
And he stretches himself across the bed. His fear gnaws urgently at his gut. And a wave of his hand is enough to silence the protest of the other boys.
Tension runs through the room like an electrical current. You're only short-circuited now when the boy in the bed makes an exaggerated snoring noise. Relief floods through the boys, and laughing, they jump on the bed and they wrestle. The bed crumbles, it shudders, communicated to the house with the noisy tumbling boys rolling across the bed. Now, the sleeper, the object of all this merriment, opens his eyes in time to see it. It's the last thing he'll ever see. A jagged piece of lumber, a veteran of the broken roof, of birds' nests, rat nests, and gnawing vermin, teeters, sways, plunges downward into the chest of the staring boy, rocking his eyes far back into his head. Only the whites of the shirt and the red of his blood as it streams from the false gaping maw of the wound. It was listed as an accident, but the villagers know better.
This is WKBW at 1520 on your Buffalo dial.
Harold was bone-tired. He and Betty had worked on the bed all day in a crash effort to finish the small work, the details. You know how long something like that can take and how tedious it can be. But it was done. And now, on the eve of their wedding anniversary, Harold and Betty had assembled it and prepared it in their bedroom. Betty, a romanticist, wanted to wait until the next night to sleep in it, but Harold said no. So tonight, for the first night, they would sleep in the auction bed. The bed of ghosts. The killer bed. They had coined a number of slang expressions for it. Harold couldn't tell whether or not Betty had joined him in this to allay her fears about the superstitions or if she really discounted them. And Betty couldn't tell whether Harold had done the same thing. But this night they were too tired to care about any superstition, and they made ready for sleep. Betty had positioned the bed in the room just so. It had to be just right. They debated for the better part of an hour over where it should be placed, and now at last Harold thought she was happy with it. A crazy quilt, a refugee from another Grange auction. Oh, God, how many Grange auctions had they been to? It lay across the bed, smiling, of warmth and comfort. Betty flopped onto her side of the bed as Harold was in the bathroom and thought of their existence in Fairhaven. The only thing that had cast a shadow across their relationship with the townspeople was the bed. Harold had slept better since coming here. He'd eaten better, felt better, certainly looked better. It was all better. It was as wonderful as she had hoped it would be. Harold, smiling, teeth brushed and tired, came into the room, and the two of them settled in for a night's sleep. Even as drowsiness overcame him, his thoughts echoed those of Betty's. Fairhaven, new friends, new outlook on life. His wife, already asleep, murmured gently as she did when she was dreaming. The husband, in the embrace of sleep, fought off images that appeared in his mind and struggled futilely against them. One was calm, peaceful, tranquil. The other, fraught with suspicion, evil, and tossing. A sudden jar of the bed, and the woman threw open her sleep-dimmed eyes. It was difficult to focus. She groped for the man she knew should be next to her. An indented pillow marked the spot where his head should lay. Covers thrown back marked the place where his body should be. Cold sheets gave no echo of where a body might have warmed them. A sudden feeling of dread. An unknown presence. A groping for the light on the night table. A flood of light, and there was Harold. And there were the sewing shears plunging into her heart. And there was the face of death. on the body her husband wore. And she was surprised. Dead. His attorneys pleaded with him to claim insanity. For some reason, he refused. The trial, the judge, the jury, the neighbors who charged into the house when Betty had screamed. Even Betty didn't know that she had screamed. The sentence, life imprisonment. 3 dark, sweatered, mute figures swept up the driveway toward the abandoned house. Their shoes crunched on the gravel as they approached it. No one in Fairhaven knew what they would be doing tonight, and technically, they would be trespassing. But they were confident that everyone in the town, including the town constable, would approve. And so they broke into the house, doing as little damage as possible, dismantled the bed, and left with it on the back of a small truck. A man named Clay had counted himself amongst the closest of friends with Harold and Betty. Next-door neighbors. It was he who had heard their shriek. He who had discovered the man standing over the blood-soaked bed and woman. And it was he who would tonight pick an obscure spot in the town dump and burn the infernal thing. Clay poured out the gasoline over the frame and, laying a trickle of a path on the ground, threw a match to it and ran as a small explosion rent the night air, and flames licked round the teak and rosewood. As he clambered into the truck, he looked at his watch. He remarked that it was too late for coffee at the diner. It was 11:30, and he couldn't take the other 2 men home with him. His wife would be furious. The morning paper listed the litany of man-made horrors. War, pestilence, politics, diplomatic bickering. And another article. Clay read aloud to his wife at the breakfast table, and she complained that his clothing reeked of gasoline. My God, listen to this. State prison officials announced that Harold Hopkins, whose spectacular trial for the scissor slaying of his wife led to life imprisonment, died in his cell last night. Hopkins died of burns over 80% of his body. Officials report that no flammable objects were in the cell and are at a loss to explain the mysterious immolation. The convicted killer was heard to scream during the night, but it was supposed by attending guards that he was having a nightmare. And no investigation was made until this morning. Officials report the screams were heard at about 11:30. 11:30. Oh my God. 11:30.